Well, we're so fortunate to have Professor Keith Taylor agree to deliver the closing remarks. He started all this, right? All this trouble, all this problem. And it's a kind of Buddhist karma that we are having him here to deliver the closing remarks after 2 days of exciting discussion. So Professor Keith Taylor, just quick introduction. He's chair and professor of Sino-Vietnamese Cultural Studies, the Department of Asian Studies at Cornell University. He has published several books that you see on the table over there, including one, kind of the most outstanding history of the Vietnamese, and many articles of Vietnamese history and literature, most recently a history of the Vietnamese. He has pioneered the teaching in North America of literary Vietnamese in a character script based on literary Chinese culture. No. Please join me to welcome Professor Taylor.
Thanks. I was quite struck by Peter's very interesting keynote yesterday morning, and especially I thought a lot about this gap that he mentioned, and that I think many of us have felt for many years, the gap between what we do in a scholarly sense and the level of public knowledge about the war. And it struck me that there must be some very important reason why that particular vision of the war that we so-called Orthodox vision, why it is so important for Americans to keep believing. There must be some reason why this this narrative remains so important, and there's so much resistance against letting it go. There's been, in the early part of my career, nobody even raised a peep against the so-called Orthodox view, because that's just how everyone seemed to think. But in the last 20, 25 years or so, we begin to see that people begin to think again. And yet, when you see the talking heads on TV or most of the textbooks and curriculum, has not yet reflected any of, or very little, if at all, of the new scholarship. Why? Why is it so important for Americans to continue to believe that, basically to take the narrative of the war as designed by the wartime propaganda of its enemy? Why? There must be an important reason. Part of it may be because it's important now for Americans to believe that they're bad, that there's all these flaws in our society. So many things we have to fix. There's so much racism and sexism and gender inequality and terrible things that are wrong. And therefore, the whole idea that, well, to imagine that in the Vietnam War, the United States actually had a good cause, how would that change the way that Americans then would think about their own history in the past 50 years? So in a way, I think that when we observe this gap, we're really, our finger has to go down to some kind of deeper problem and issue. I don't claim to understand it myself. I have my own ideas, but I think they're still pretty, I'm not really able to articulate them in a way that makes sense to other people, probably. The lessons of the Vietnam War we used to talk about all the time. I think that there are lessons of the war, but not the lessons that people normally think about. For example, the all-volunteer army, the lesson not to rely on a conscripted army anymore. Now, our leaders can send our soldiers all around the world and fight wars, and there's no big, strong anti-war movement, and it affects a very tiny part of our population. And we think that that's the way it should be, that that's healthy for a democracy. Maybe it's not a very good lesson. Another lesson, which many of us don't even remember or realize anymore, is how we nominate our presidential candidates. When did the presidential primaries begin? They came about as a result of the war. After '68 and all the uproar in the politics of that year, the parties moved to have primaries. And we can see now the long-term effects of that, pushing public discourse to the edges and the loss of our political center. A shift we see from public service to everyone finding their own group and defending it. It's very, very difficult to get people to believe that they can have a civil conversation with others who, with whom they disagree. It's increasingly a problem, I think, at least from what I see at the university. But times are changing. I think this is the real problem, is that times really are changing, and they're changing very fast, and nobody really has much of a clue where we're going, or where this is all going to end up. But, and there's another lesson maybe that we're seeing again, which is it's okay to abandon an ally. It's okay. We can do it again. Well, I just want to waste your time. I hope not too badly. Just a couple little points that struck me, key moments in the war that I think are especially full of potential to shift our view if we would just kind of think about them again. For example, the whole episode of the Republic of Vietnam that we've been talking about from 1955 to 75 began with this Geneva Conference in 1954. And I find over and over again, people have such mythological ideas about what that conference was about, what it achieved, what it was, the results were. There's this myth that you find in many, many books and textbooks, and everyone sort of thinks that this was an agreement that was signed by all these countries. But no one signed. There's no signatures on it. Nobody signed the final declaration. The only thing that was ever signed at Geneva was the ceasefire accord. These were signed by mid-level military officers from the DRV and from France, just to stop the fighting. Other than that, nobody signed anything. As a result, if you read the studies of that agreement made by international lawyers, it's very controversial. Some lawyers would say it really doesn't have the kind of force in international law that we would expect an international agreement of that sort to have, because no one was willing to put their signature on it, no country. Others say, well, they did have this final declaration, and they stood around and toasted to it, and so it's good enough. But in any case, it has had wonderful propaganda value through the years, and that's probably the main thing. The problem with the thing that a lot of people don't understand is, as well as I wish they did when I speak and lecture about this, is the contradiction that's built into the Geneva Agreement, the final declaration. There's a contradiction built into it, which would lie at the problem that would be part of how the war developed in the subsequent years. The contradiction being that yes, you have this final declaration that claims that Vietnam is one country, united, sovereign, and has territorial integrity, and at the same time, it partitions this country into two parts. And yes, in order to kind of pass over that contradiction, there's this provision that in 2 years there'll be an election and you'll be united. I don't think that it's very plausible to imagine that this was a very serious consideration. The big powers, what was their whole point of Geneva was to put the Vietnam question, to make it quiet, to take it off the table as a Cold War flashpoint. The idea of an election, you could not have an election. Anybody with a realistic sense of what was going on there would see that there could be no election without starting another war. And we see very clearly that when Hanoi in 1956 complained to UK and USSR, who were the two co-conveners of the Geneva Conference, complained about the fact that there was no election. The British handed the complaint to the Americans. The Americans put it in a drawer, and the Soviets simply ignored it. They didn't want to be bothered with this. Furthermore, a year later, in '57, Khrushchev does this curious thing where he proposes that both Vietnams be admitted to the United Nations. Of course, it was a kind of ploy, perhaps, which is how it was interpreted at the time, to try to get both Germanys admitted to the United Nations. But at the same time, if he was willing to throw the Vietnam situation on the table, I don't think that the larger communist powers were that interested in trying to have a united Vietnam. In fact, I think in China's perspective, it was good to keep a divided Vietnam. That would serve their interests, their purpose. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, around the Geneva Agreement. And also, in 1955, in October, this famous referendum that Ngo Dinh Diem held, a lot of people don't really understand what that was about either, at least from the way I read it. In 1953, France had officially granted independence to Cambodia and to Laos. And in 1954, they recognized the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But France never recognized the independence of the state of Vietnam. There was an independence treaty negotiated in the spring of '54, and it was initialed at the early part of the Geneva Conference, but it was never ratified by the French. Because why? Because the French considered that that would just be too much of a complication for them trying to work out an agreement with North Vietnam, unless they could also speak for what was going on in the South. So the referendum, I think, was Diem's way of declaring independence against France. Getting rid of Bao Dai was really to cut the cord with France and establish the possibility of building a country in the South. Another flashpoint is, just mentioned briefly, is this, what happened at the Hue radio station in May of 1963? What happened? Nobody really knows. There's all these theories. It was the Viet Cong. No, it was the South Vietnamese Army. And the most interesting theory of all, some of you may know this book, Thế nào làm chết một tổng thống, which has a very interesting theory that it was actually the Americans who did this. And they have some sort of anecdotal evidence about that. But that's something that remains to be looked at. And And yet it was such a critical event, a very critical moment. I think that it'd be interesting to move on from what we did here these last 2 days toward a more systematic and analytical comparison of the First and Second Republics. The whole trajectory of kind of dynamic political events moving from 1955 to 75 and all of the changes in the Republic of Vietnam. It's an incredibly vibrant time, a lot of change, and the two republics are being very, very different. And we see now the attention that has begun to be put on the First Republic and increasing on the Second Republic. And I think it would be interesting to look more at a comparative sense, because the two republics are very different, of course, and they each had their own separate, different visions about what they wanted the future of the country to be, and different relationships, different concepts between rural and urban. And so that's something to look at. But what I would really be more interested in having more research on is the interregnum. That's 20% of the time of these from 55 to 75 for 4 years. This period between the two republics, more interested in hearing more about the way the very rapid kind of political movements occurred one after another. The great desire that there was in the country for a constitutional government, and how this came about. I think, I don't know exactly, I haven't done the detailed research, but enough to get an impression that Nguyen Cao Thi really had a lot to do with bringing together the military officers and the civilian politicians to make this agreement that was embodied in the Constitution of the Second Republic. That whole process is something that is worth looking into. Well, I'm just reminded this afternoon of an anecdote that when in 1986, I was invited to go to Hanoi by the Institute of Archaeology. And I spent a couple weeks there with historians and archaeologists. And I met another scholar there. And as we got to talking, we realized that he'd been in the North Vietnamese Army, and I was in the U.S. Army in the same area at the same time. And we even, as we were curious about this seeming coincidence, discovered that we were familiar with the same kind of the same events and operations over a few weeks period of time. And all of a sudden, though, in the conversation, it didn't feel good. It didn't feel right. I think we both felt something, and we stopped talking. And I don't remember who said it, him or I don't remember anymore, but one of us said, "Chúng tôi là những người còn sống." We're the survivors. And it really ended that part of that conversation. We just didn't have any taste to talk about the war anymore. Reminded about the cost of the war, the human cost. And someone mentioned survivor's guilt this afternoon, and I think we definitely felt that. a debt to those who didn't survive, and it struck me over and over to watch this conference and people coming from all around the world talking about this war, and it's really wonderful in the sense that this probably couldn't have happened before. And for many years, when I got into this business, this would just be a dream. It would be like nobody could imagine an event like this. Anytime you get some people who, some academics together to talk about Vietnam, there's just a pitiful group of people arguing about the war all the time. And this is great. But I sort of feel that, I felt the presence of all the people. You know, the war, to talk about a war academically is one thing, but to experience it and to think about what actually happens in the war, all of the death and the destruction and the maiming and the pain and the suffering, and all of the terrible things that happen, the human cost of it. It's just something I wanted to mention, that we keep in the back of our minds when we do our research, that this isn't just for us and our career, but this is serious business about being a human being in the world. And that we do have well, maybe we don't, but some of us do. Those of us who feel it, but you don't have to feel it if you don't want to, but have a kind of debt to all those people who suffered, to try and seek the truth to the best we can. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Professor Taylor. We don't have time for questions, unfortunately, but so I would like just to get up a few short remarks to first to thank you, for your enthusiastic participation. The great quality of the research that, like those of you who have read the papers agree that, they're really super, and I believe there's enough material for like 2 books and a special journal issue. So, but I learned a lot from the conversation, and the theme of republicanism, Republican Vietnam proves to be resonant with a lot of research that people have been working on, and it's also plastic enough to accommodate like scholars of colonial Vietnam all the way to the diasporic community. So it's quite a useful concept to think think of as a research program in the next few years. And so I'm very optimistic about the prospects of this, even though I'm aware of the challenges in terms of all the inconclusive debates and the diversity of viewpoints and the lack of the coherence. I mean, even in the concept of republicanism itself, it's kind of, you need to do a lot of spade work to persuade the people that it does carry some value. That's it in terms of publication plan. So I'm going to contact the authors individually within the next few weeks. Hopefully we could get a book out in a year or so. That's the plan. It's up to you as well to kind of revise your papers and so on, to respond to my emails.